Hi, welcome back to Future Fast. And like always, we've got a very interesting guest, and also personally, I know him for a long time, so that makes it special for me. And at the end of this conversation, I'm sure all of you listeners and audience will also perhaps find it as special as I did, and I do. And second thing is that those of you who are here for the first time, I urge you to go look up. We've had some amazing people come in for Future Fast, talked about various things, and literally across the globe, right? 4, 5 continents, and very diverse background, and some very contrary opinions as well. So the whole idea is that we want to bring in people with different perspectives so that you be the judge of what you think you should go after. And also, we urge you, please go do your own research and follow people where you find them interesting, curious, and engage them, because all these people are very interested in engaging with uh, interesting thoughts. So, with that, we have Giri Balasubramaniam. And for most of you, at least from India, will know him as the Mr. Pickbrain. And for the rest of you, you will discover him as we go along. And in one word introduction, he's the reigning, I don't know if I can call it, Giri, the emperor of quiz in India. So, Giri, welcome to Future Fast.
Thank you. Pleasure is always mine. Lovely to reconnect.
Oh, well, Giri, how did your journey from, I mean, I remember you were always a quizzing enthusiast. You were always representing, I think, all through your academic career, you were part of the quiz teams, no matter which institution you were with. But how did your journey from being a professional sales and marketing professional to uh, becoming an entrepreneur, and that to making a hobby into a business? So, can you share your journey with us?
Yeah, the transition was a tough one. It wasn't necessarily a seamless one. I come from an era, or we come from an era when uh, life was not offering us as much choices as it offers youngsters today. Viable options. The options were available, but I should prefix it perhaps with the word viable, which would, put bread and butter on the table. So given those odds, I think all of us took professions which basically put bread and butter on the table. I went the media route and became a media professional and started working in the media. The quizzer in me, as you put it, never really died. So there was always the inkling to go and be part of the odd trivia show here, there, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, given that I grew up in Bangalore, the only outlet for quizzing was pub quizzes. And even in those days, we used to have these odd evening pub quizzes. And that did not necessarily suit my palate because I happened to be a teetotaler. So that genre of quizzing didn't really, get me to play my quizzing more often. And therefore, I used to conduct odd quizzes for schools and so on. So it stayed on in that form, but in a very informal way, more like a very good singer who's not got an avenue to sing anymore. That's probably how I was like a fish out of pond. And then life moved on. The passion was deep. It was always the thought thinking, okay, what should I do? What should I not? That was around the time when the dot-com era was starting. I'm talking circa 2000. And that's when the dot-com boom was happening and content was becoming digital. And that's pretty much when I conceptualized and thought quizzing can become a form of gaming. And it can be self-mode and not necessarily the anchored on-stage mode. So we created an idea, or what one would call then a pitch, and went around talking to a couple of dot-coms. So indiainfo.com at that time showed great interest. and I ended up creating a portal called Quizbrain. So that's really how the transition from Disney to sort of full-time quizzing happened. And the portal did exceedingly well for the time frame that it was there. So that's really how the interest for quizzing and from a sales and marketing career transcended into giving it a shot and saying, okay, let me see if it works out.
You also had this Pickbrain in Times of India, right? While you were working there?
Yeah, so the Pickbrain part was more to do with Times of India creating something called Offspring, which was for school children. Now it's called the student edition of the Times of India. But in those days when I was there, it was one page in the paper for school children. And it required child-friendly content. So I had enough questions in my bank then. So I used to write about 10, 15 questions every fortnight in the paper. But they could not give me the byline of my name, which is Giri Balasubramaniam, because technically I was not in the editorial team. So I was in the brand team, and that came under marketing. And in those days, rules were very strict for getting bylines in a paper. And I would believe that is how it should be. You earn your right to get a byline in a paper. So I would respect that immensely even today. And therefore, Giri could not appear, and then we had to coin something. So pseudonym was coined, and that's how Pickbrain was born. But I guess Pickbrain for children became far more easier than Giri Balasubramaniam. So that's really how it stuck on. It's a long journey now, but that's really how it came about. And then also I started seeing the traction for it. So we said, okay, there seems to be some kind of a business model that we can work around. So that's really how one made another, and then we moved on.
And you stuck with it, right? I mean, you rather enjoy that today, the Pickbrain.
Absolutely. I've got no regrets. I still speak to a lot of my friends who got into the same mold with me at Walt Disney, etc., and so on. Probably if you take their stock options, etc., into account, financially, I may be nowhere close to where they were, but we built our own company, our own enterprise. We've got some fabulous people who now do quizzing, and no regrets, because ultimately you can't take those few dollars more and go when you go. So it's what's the point in doing that? I'm not a great believer in living poor and dying rich.
That's a great line. I like to believe in that too. But tell me something. A lot of people start business, and see, I've been an entrepreneur for a very long time. I started first time in '96. So, and I've done so many things. I do believe we all evolve. We keep evolving, and I've had multiple of that, so to speak. But how did you manage to stay on with one line of business? Of course, you have branched out with new offerings and a lot of other things, but the core of it remains the same. So, what is your core learning otherwise from whatever you've come from, and how is that helping you with this kind of a persistence?
Quite honestly, we've also been three companies in 20 years. Though the name probably has been the same and the brand has been the same. And unfortunately, if I may put it, in a country like India, the personality tends to supersede the company, especially in the genre that we are in. So people sometimes think even today that we are just a quizzing company, which we are not. We're so much more than a quizzing company. But the core of what we've been doing is to actually ignite human curiosity, if I may put it in a simple way. So that hasn't changed for us. So maybe we've grown from an idli dosa joint into sometimes fine dining, to realizing the idli dosa gives you better profitability. So we've done those iterations over our 20-year journey, and then probably moved further with the same batter to create, vada and something else. That's honestly how things have grown. But two things have made us last the journey. One, I think, is the core fact that whether it was me who started it and the people who joined me, there was this very deep, innate passion for knowledge and quizzing. I think when your passion is so deep, then you're willing to make that compromise with a few lakhs at the end of the year when you file your returns and say, fine, I'm still doing what I love doing, so let's keep at it. Not necessarily everyone stayed the course with us for 20 years on that ideology. Some people even accuse me and say that's your, if I may call it, Gandhian economics that I force on my company. But people who have wanted to stay here have stayed beyond the economics of it. Having said that, it's not bad economics. I don't want youngsters today to think that, we live in deep poverty and, fight for our passion. No. We're extremely well-paid people. We recruit from the IITs. We recruit from the IIMs. People don't come, for love and fresh air. So everyone still wants their decent life and wants money to see the world and so on and so forth. But yeah, if you compare a Greycaps job with, an MNC or a consulting firm, we wouldn't measure up. But we're honest about that on day one. So if you understand what you're getting into, it works well. The second reason why we've lasted it out, I honestly feel, is from the consumer side. We've fortunately been in the space in the last 20 years when the very importance and cognizance attached to knowledge and self-development has improved vastly. So the number of people wanting to become knowledgeable after formal education has been huge. That's kept our audience with us.
Well, I just connected with what you said about sustaining curiosity. In fact, that was one of the reasons for me to think of starting Future Fast, because the more people I talk to, it seemed like most people no longer have any curiosity about what's going to happen in future. They're so busy about today and very near tomorrow, right? It's not too far. Nobody's, at least most people had stopped. The very people who used to talk to me, discuss with me about things, are so narrowly focused about a very short term. So I think it's very important to have keep giving a key to the curiosity. So which you've been doing it amazingly, and I think do you have some kind of an alumni? I was just wondering, do you have an alumni of Greycaps?
We do, but quite honestly, the company works in two states of mind, if I may call it. One is the state of mind of people who work in the research side of Greycaps. That alumni is a stronger alumni. And then you've got alumni who primarily work on the marketing side of Greycaps. And I don't think
I was thinking, yeah, that's obviously the direct alumni, but I was actually thinking about the people you have touched from quizzing
yes,
point of view as the participant.
Yeah. That's the huge. We don't probably, maybe alumni is a more respectful word, and we should consider that. We call it community. We call it, more specifically at Greycaps, we call them the knowledge tribe. So the knowledge tribe does not represent us. It represents people who appreciate knowledge. So that's huge. And today that's a measurable community.
Are you engaging them?
In a big way on social media, yes. So we've got a following of roughly about viewership of about 20 million people, but we've got a following of about, I think 5 million, 6 million, all digital assets put together. So there are people across who really engage. A large part of them would still be students. I would like to believe that a large part of them would still be students, maybe 50%.
Well, I guess most of us remain students, otherwise you won't take you.
I hope so. I wish for it to be that way. But we don't see that reflecting in the quizzes that we do over a period of time. We see more repeat participants coming in for corporate quiz shows. It's not necessarily a growing community. At age, it grows as people enter corporate. So you see the pyramid growing at the age range of 25 to 35. But once you cross 35, it's the guy who's a diehard quizzer who keeps quizzing. So for him, it's no longer quizzing, it's a sport. It's a sport he plays. So it's like chess. You just keep playing it. So I don't see too many people entering quizzing at 35 or 40 and saying, hey, I used to quiz in college and school, let me quiz again. We've seen very few instances in that space.
Interesting. Well, I'll hold my questions on that direction to talk about it on the business side. So now, what is it that you're doing now? You think that will help you succeed going forward in future? More from you as Giri and from your effort, not from a business or the business strategy, which we'll talk separately. I thought more from you as an individual.
Since you're speaking future fast, what we're actually working on, though I may be jumping the gun and sharing this, maybe you're the first public platform I'm sharing this with, we're actually trying to create a digital avatar of Pickbrain. So an avatar in the digital connotation of avatar. So
getting into metaverse then.
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay.
So we're seeing how the physical person need not be present, but the nuances of that personality is captured through digital. And the core of it still is delivery of content and to ignite curiosity. So I see no reason why the human cannot be replaced in terms of time and availability to an avatar or a medium appropriate creation, if I may call it that. I don't know if they'll create a big brain robo one day, but those are genuinely the things we are considering. Also because knowledge is now becoming global currency. It's not only the countries which liked a sport like trivia. Today, I get invited to host shows in Japan. I get invited to host shows all over the Middle East. Singapore has been something we've been working in for the last 10 years. We get invited in UK, Europe. It's going to be humanly impossible to go to these destinations and do these programs. From a cost economy-wise as well, it does not make sense because there are occasions when our charges are lower than the flight charges. So it's impractical. So you got to find ways and means by which I think we need to get to digital.
So tell us about your role with government and administration that you took up a role in between, right? And I think you also continue to do some role with NEP and.
Two reasons why I got into it. One is I think India is evolving significantly in the space of addressing the future. Not perhaps as fast as your program suggests, but at least addressing the future. So what happened is it actually started when India turned 60. There was a fair amount of collective thought on what to do when India turned 75. And when India turned 75, I think a couple of these people who were there when this vision at 75, which also had Dr. Kalam involved, were evaluating how much of that have we achieved. They found that the traction was not necessarily more than a fourth of what was desired there. So if let's say they had 100 goals, then they probably achieved only 25 of those, which many would turn around and say is still significant. Okay, that's one way of looking at it. But they started saying, so what do you do at 75 to look at India at 100? How do you get to start thinking in terms of India at 100? And the more pertinent question was, who's thinking future? It's something probably your program tries to address as well, that none of us allocate time to think through tomorrow. We're so obsessed with today We're so obsessed with the mistakes of yesterday, we don't allocate time for tomorrow. And that manifests itself in a huge way when it comes to nation building and future forecasting a country. All the more when you sub-focus that into a genre like education, where I was involved. If someone in the system, while India turns 75, is not thinking what our children are going to be when India turns 100, then we are doing a disservice to the youth of this country. So fortunately, it also overlapped in time frame with the new education policy coming into force in this country. A fabulous document. I'm a great believer that no policy can be perfect. Every policy is a framework on which you build and you probably iterate as you move through the journey. Because none of us in perfection are able to look through the future. No one's done that historically. If it was, we wouldn't have had COVID. So, it's a clear example that no one's able to look through things. Or even if they look through, there are areas that you can't, imagine. So given that belief that I carry, I think this was at best the kind of a policy framework that you would have, which addressed the future. And what I really liked about that document is it was completely futuristic and not really digging into the past, which is what India requires. I think as a nation, we carry too much of our baggages from the past. We spend too much of time in our past, debating and deliberating things that could have been, would have been, should have been, rather than spending some amount of that time. I'm not for a moment saying that's not required, it is. We've got phenomenal cultural heritage, we've got phenomenal knowledge of India, all of which we've lost over a period of time, which we must encash upon. But that does not mean you get chained to your past. You've got to look at the future, because singing praises of your past will not take you forward. So this document to me was in many ways a reason to get into government. I was very clear I wanted to play a role only in government. The Karnataka government happened to become the first to initiate a sort of a lateral entry program called the Indian Administrative Fellowship. And so it was an official designated role, which came down from someone as senior as a chief secretary of the government. So we clearly had a role to play. It was a 9-to-5 job. We worked with very senior bureaucrats. So I worked quite literally with the principal secretary who would run school education in Karnataka. And there were overlapping moments, of course, with central government because of the policy. And it's also good to see the governance side of government, which is the bureaucracy, really keen to bring in perspectives from outside. I think I must document my view on that. It's fabulous and humbling.
Was this a bureaucracy's effort to bring in lateral thinking, or was it the political effort to bring in the lateral thinking into bureaucracy?
The structure and framework of how the IAF would work was largely created by bureaucracy, and in very Indian terms, I would say blessed by the political system.
Yeah, I guess that's how it should be, but I'm just curious about where did the original thought or idea came into play here, because obviously bureaucrats have to make it happen, even if it's an idea from a politician, because politicians can't make it happen, right?
I think the original thought came from the realization that these bureaucrats, who actually in core reality run the country, they are like the COOs of our business, right? They are the ones who operate.
It came from the bureaucrats itself?
Yeah, I think the ideas came from bureaucrats, who are very keen to bring in people. Because see, if you really look at a bureaucrat...
Well, if it did, it's amazing, because I think it could potentially threaten their very jobs, right? In UK, it's primarily professionals who come in to play the bureaucratic role by their merit of abilities of having demonstrated in a professional world of delivering things or operating things to come into play here in the government.
So I think there were people in the bureaucracy who thought that way too. all right, that it could be a threat. And, who are these people to come in and tell us what to do? Would be perhaps a fair line to use. No one made us feel that way. I mean, I wouldn't want to, nobody ever made us feel that way. We felt extremely welcome. We were respected for our expertise in our domain, etc. I think what you're saying is very true in smaller countries. It'll never happen in India. With all my experience in education, at best, I would be able to influence policy and implementation in small pilots. I would never, ever have the exposure and wherewithal to run it at scale. I'll give you a math. Karnataka alone is 48,000 plus schools, and I'm talking only government schools. I'm not talking of our central board schools. We have 1.08 crore children. How would I walk into the system like an emperor, if you refer to me as one, and try to bring about change? Because I don't know how the system runs. The bureaucrats who architected this realized that. Now, their lives, unfortunately, and we've got a fairly large shortage of bureaucrats in this country, unfortunately, their lives are so hectic managing today's problems. Much as they are tremendously capable, they do not have the time to sit down and think future. So all that they required was people who would come in with domain expertise so they don't have to waste time teaching me what is education and what is the policy. I come in with the experience. I give them a framework and a set of recommendations. If time permits and it's possible, I pilot it and test it whether the idea is a workable idea. And then they take that model and replicate it. So it's pretty much like an incubator center. It works very similar to probably how an incubating system works in the venture capital world. I think if the idea can be taken at scale, it's one of the best ways to bring about change in India and to make a nation move forward.
Well, interesting. Maybe I will ask you for another time to have a debate or maybe exchange of thoughts on generally on the administrative service. I have other ideas, so probably since you work closely, maybe it would be good to have this conversation. Perhaps also bring in some IAS also into the conversation. Maybe someone who's retired could probably be more open about it.
No, 100% you should, because see, the system comprises of people who are different types. There may be people in different parts of the country who just don't care. I would not for a moment say that the entire system is aligned and prays for a better future and works for a better future. There will be the odd people in any profession. Even in corporate life, you'll have people in a corporate world who are not necessarily aligned to the goals of the company. You only align to your personal, property development, and then you leave the company and just jump. So, but in bureaucracy, the fantastic thing is their tenure time is huge. Their tenure time in that job and profession is huge. The kind of view and insight they have on different departments is phenomenal. Not at all something that is replaceable by someone who just walks in. But if they are open to outside perspectives, which they are, and I'm genuinely an example of having experienced that, I think a lot of traction can happen. But yes, it comes with its bag of issues sometimes. You work with an IAS officer, you're working with him or her, you work for 7 months, you're working on a project, you're working on a plan, you've said, okay, in 1 year you're going to implement this. Suddenly one evening he calls you and says, Giri, tomorrow morning I'm transferred. And then you're like, what? That's life. I mean, I've been asked to move. And the next person comes in and may have his or her own ideas. Sometimes it goes a little back and forth. Those things are there. But that, I think we overdo it. It happens with a corporate when a CEO changes. You got a new CEO comes in with new ideas and sometimes says, hey, I don't really think we should do it the way the old guy did it or the previous guy did it. So if you negate those things and say those things will exist in society, if someone's still willing to at least get documents done for the future, at least they have a ready reckoner kit to take and put into execution mode. So the system and the fabric that has thought this through, I think, is fantastic. It's just fair that we give it a chance. The other way that I look at it, which was the second reason why I went in, is what is the alternative option to bring about change? You can keep sitting outside the system and keep saying our systems don't work and we don't change it and we don't do anything about it. So you can either be a bystander and keep complaining about it, or get into it, soil your hands and say, okay, let me see if I can help you set this right. So I would rather do the latter than the former. So that's the reason I really got into it and put in 2 years there.
Well, I like the whole positive thing about it. So I really hope this thing continues. Giri, do you want to talk about people who have made the impact from a point of making or thinking the way you do today?
Yeah, it would start with the college both of us shared our time with. I think apart from school teacher influences, which I think were more confidence influencers. At my school, I had a lot of people who influenced my confidence to speak, my confidence to probably stand up, and so on. But the person who really gave me a perspective change, the first perspective change in my life, I think, came from Dr. H. Narasimhaya. I owe my moments and time that I spent with him, though I spent more time with him after we left National College and not while I was at National College, because I think he was too larger than life an image for us while we were there. And if he used to come walking from that side, we would just move the other way. But post that, I think
I remember any time of the day we meet, he would say, "Good morning." And once I made a mistake of saying, "Good afternoon, sir." He looks at me and said, "Good morning." I said, "Well, I know, but we are meeting for the first time, and that's when the morning happens for us." I said, "Okay, sir."
So he was a profound influence on me in terms of my perspectives getting shaped. So sometimes we as individuals confuse people who instill confidence in us from those who can instill a perspective difference in us. So I always differentiate the two. People who instill perspective difference make a lot of impact on the course of life that you choose to take. And I think Dr. H. Narasimhaya was the first contributor to that for me. He also got me to probably value humility and simplicity in profound ways. He was a Gandhian himself. For all his accomplishments, the kind of life he led made me really look at him very differently after we had passed out of college and so on. So I think he was the first big influence on me. The second and the largest in my life, and I think I'm blessed on that count, would undoubtedly be Dr. APJ Abdul. The years that I spent with him in his shadows or in his presence, whatever one may call it, completely changed my view of life, at least from the perspective of having any commercial objectives as ultimate goals. I think in very mathematical terms that Dr. Kalam tries to put everything, he made me realize that impact is greater than bank balance. And if you can be on the impact side where you've touched more lives, as you put it, I think it'll even out. It need not be a not-for-profit effort, is also something I learned while I was with him. It could be a very commercial effort while having the heart in the right place. So,
Wow. That's amazing that you got to engage with, in fact, I've had very few occasions of meeting him very briefly. And in fact, I heard him a few times also in a public gathering where we got to meet him closely because I was with a group who had access to him. But unfortunately, it's so odd, but the 3 times I heard, most of his speech was repeated, and I just couldn't form a better opinion of him, right? Because he was repeating the same thing what he spoke the other day and the other day. So second time I thought, okay, maybe it's a different audience, so he's talking about it. And third time was also the different audience. But I don't know why he forgets that he's also on record. So,
no, I guess, see, there were, I did a lot of, I mean, I've seen him address across geographies. There were elements which he passionately believed in. And I think some of these people who changed the trajectory of nations, and he was one of them. He changed India's view about India, I think. And he brought in this, I think he was the first one to say a vision for a nation, in a modern era. And I think all of us are a fallout of that in some small measure. And he held 5 or 6 things which were so passionate that I think he would re-emphasize on that time and again, because he felt those core things needed to be spoken about. And in different ways, some of these people have inspired me to read about the lives of a lot of leaders. I've done that. I love autobiographies. I love autobiographies because it tells you the life people actually lived. I'm not a great fiction reader. These days even normal newscasts can be fiction, so you don't have to search too much for it. But autobiographies teach you a lot. So even if you read Gandhi deeply, you'll find him speak ahimsa, non-violence. You'll find him speak, so to say, Swadeshi, self-reliance, trusteeship. It comes across repeatedly because they so deeply believe in those 4 or 5 things. So
I think you're right, because for quite some time I was trying to refer to some people about some of the things that I've written or talked about on the distributed economy and tokenization, and I do find myself repeating because
yeah,
I tried to use different use cases, but end up repeating most of it because.
So I think what one needs to look at when you look at such personalities is what was their desired outcomes of what they were speaking.
No, that's true.
They were trying to trigger certain outcomes. They were trying to influence certain mindsets, and they were supremely successful at that. And with Dr. Kalam, I keep making this statement, and I mean it very deeply. If your purpose is right and your intent is right, in as deeply divided a society we can be at times, we're not always that, but there are time frames when we can bring our divisions, more into the visible zone than it is required. Even in those moments of division, I've never seen this country ever look at Dr. Kalam as a Muslim. Never, ever. They always look at him as an Indian. It's chilling, but it's true. And otherwise,
I think it was little unfortunate at the time he was made president. The conversation was that because he's a Muslim, he's made a president, right? And in fact, the party that made him a president at that time, even I think I remember their party spokesperson speaking on TV that it is we who made a Muslim president.
Yeah, so
that was unfortunate.
It's very unfortunate. See, I think the levels at which these decisions are made, and if you go back in that time frame, we're referring to Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who arguably would be one of India's most statesmanly prime ministers that we've had. What a man, and what a combination of president and prime minister at that time. If one looks at it from an intellect point of view, you've got a scientist and a poet both at the same time at the helm. You can't wish better for a nation like India.
That's a true serendipity of.
Yeah. And the great amount of mutual respect that they had. See, the people who offer the narratives are often the people who create the problems. It's never the problem. It's never a problem at the helm. It's never a problem at the bottom of the pyramid. It's always a problem with the narrative community which is in between. country after country. I'm not for a moment referring to India. I'm not for a moment referring to, religion problems in this region of the world. It could be color in some other region. It could be disproportionate incomes in another part of the world. Problems manifest itself in different forms, but these are basically problems, which are human created. So the narratives become that way, but to not lose the context of what we're talking, the point I'm trying to make is some of these people come with a great amount of ability to influence a mindset in a direction that is ultimately beneficial for the nation. That is what makes them great. And if you can channelize what you are doing with some ultimate good to the nation, then I think that's the learning.
Very well put. So, Giri, what kind of books, podcasts, or movies? What would you recommend to our listeners and audience?
Oh my God! These days I live in a complex maze between my father, who's inching 90, wanting to re-watch Guns of Navarone and the likes, and a generation between my daughter and son who make me watch things on Netflix and Amazon Prime that I otherwise would not have watched, from serials and so on. But I think the quality of content that's available to us is phenomenal. It's absolutely phenomenal. You got to choose what genre suits you and then look at it. It's also giving you an opportunity to actually learn wider than your interest areas. Because I don't think in our era, where accumulation of any form of wisdom meant directly spending time in libraries, is required anymore. So they give you this opportunity as digital repositories to really go through whatever you want. I was recently watching a program, I think it's a Netflix series or an Amazon series. I can never recall which one. The platforms haven't mattered to me. My daughter was watching it. The Designated President was a phenomenal program that I watched. It's an American series where a guy is designated to be the president. They have this thing, right, when all of them are in Capitol Hill and someone gets designated and the place gets
they
bombed.
have some hierarchy of making a president, and he becomes.
Yeah, and this person becomes an accidental president. And how he takes on the presidency is phenomenally well told story. But I think I spend my time more with documentaries. I spend a lot of my time with TED Talks. I think that's a fabulous creation in this world for people who know what genre they want to listen to. So I never got to meet Dr. Ken Robinson, but I would have heard everything that he's spoken. It wouldn't have been possible without, digital. So those are the kind of things that I indulge myself in. I'm still a very book reader generation. So if I could choose between reading it as an e-book and a physical book, my choice is still a physical book. So I am wired that way. It's very difficult for anybody to read a book that I have read, because a quizmaster can be a horrible book reader because all markings all over in terms of potential questions. Read more on this, deeper.
You can't really take yourself away from doing it, right?
It's difficult. Initially, I could, but having done this for 20, 25 years, I think it's very difficult. I think it's become like muscle memory. Your subconscious sense is always looking at questions.
But will you be able to enjoy reading at that rate? I mean, you read something, this makes a great question. I mean, you.
No, but reading itself is an enjoyment. So I think you go with that. I'm probably like a boatman in a river who loved boating, but ended up chauffeuring people from one side to the other. But he still enjoys that boat ride. So that's probably the analogy that I would give. So we've become like that, but that's become the profession. And because I refused to leave the waters, I started making a living in the waters. It does not take the joy out of our reading at all. No, I don't think so. I do breakaway reads. We don't read only what is meant for research. So I do a lot of breakaway reading. Nowadays, I think it's more breakaway viewing rather than reading. So I do spend a fair amount of my time watching some of these, especially on transit. I find it a little difficult to read on transit nowadays. It's because the only difference is, I think, reading inherently for quizzers, quizmasters is deep reading. You're not surface reading, but sometimes the enjoyment comes out of surface. So I think that's where I do a few ebooks, I do a few breakaway books, self-help books, stuff like that. Also, books which are popular, it's a compulsion for us to read those too, because questions from those popular books make us popular or relevant, which way to put it. For example, 10 years ago, I would have aced a Harry Potter quiz. Not because I loved J.K. Rowling's way of writing, but just because I wanted to know more than the kids about, Harry Potter, which makes them feel you're generationally relevant. So it's very, very important to read what your audience reads. So that's a trick to be a good quizmaster too.
Right.
So yeah, I'm not necessarily able to draw that same parallel with music. I still run back to Jagjit Singh. Yeah, I can't quite therefore sit and listen to the modern genres of music. But I think we've got
a teetotaler who enjoys listening to someone who starts singing after having a good shot of whiskey.
Or a teetotaler who's asking phenomenal questions on beverages and brewery because they expect you to not ask those questions. So that's a good way to stump people. They're like, some quizzers have actually asked me, hey, that question was super, but aren't you a teetotaler? I'm like, well, I know you'll make that pre-judgment, but that's the point. So yeah, it's good fun. I mean, and the whole idea is we've made it fun. I think that's another reason why we've lasted. I think as a company, people who come here enjoy it. I've got people in their 30s with me who've completed 10 years with me. I never thought that would happen, which means something in this company made them stick and feel every morning when they woke up that, fine, this is the right place to go to for work. So, and they come from phenomenal, I mean, from IIM, from NITs, institutes which would have got them to probably more economically alluring jobs, but they've stayed here and stayed the course. So we're no longer, let me have a nice stint and enjoy it for a year or so. I don't think we're that. We've become a very serious career space in that sense.
Rather, you managed to sustain the fun.
Which is why,
long enough.
Yeah, because see how much of my passion can make them stay. They have to find their passion. Otherwise, it's not going to work. You can't run your life on someone else's heartbeat. Absolutely. So something must have clicked for them.
Well, Giri, you didn't give me a book, one or two books at least. You did mention a name and TEDx for people. Perhaps they could follow that. Any recommendation of books?
Well, wrong person to ask because I would recommend a library. But for simple things, sometimes people think we read a lot of complicated books. One of the books I have read, reread, and reread is actually Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
Okay.
It's a classic. It's an absolute classic. It's a story of a seagull which just breaks its barriers and decides to fly further and higher.
Something I read 30 years ago, plus.
Even to this day, when I address children, youngsters, I recommend Jonathan Livingston Seagull.
The today's generation read that?
Yeah, I hope they do. I at least push them to do that. Okay. So I find a lot of relevance in those books. I don't use the word wisdom because wisdom is what you derive from a book. There is relevance in those books. Corporate genre, in India, if you're an Indian reader, I've always appreciated reading about people in India, and I've always wanted to read about Indian corporate history as well. Those are areas that have excited me. To me, two phenomenal books on people in India will remain Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography and Kalam's autobiography. I think two phenomenally documented books. To this day, for me, My Experiments with Truth is an unbelievable book. How could someone live a consistently non-violent life in a violent world? I can't understand that. I can't fathom that. We find it difficult to do it today, but Gandhi did it. So it fascinates me. Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela, again, a remarkable book. 27 years in solitary confinement, and then you come out a positive man. We couldn't think positive after 2 years of COVID confinement. I mean, 27 years. It's true. It's so true. I mean, COVID was the world's way to imprison us, and that imprisonment didn't help. We were restless, we were anxious, we were argumentative. We just couldn't get along with our own kith and kin.
But somewhere I think it did manage to get people to get comfortable working from home. So
I don't know if that's good
it was
or
more
bad.
an acclimatization period of
Yeah,
frustration.
I don't know if that's good or bad, but Nelson Mandela to me as a life was a phenomenal example. Remarkable man to come out of 27 years and then look at the future, which is the context of what we're talking. The man never looked at his past. The man never once kept speaking of what should not have happened. He just spoke of what needs to happen. I think that's the lesson we need to take. The world has its own way of providing you a sunset. And I think the reason the sunset happens every day is for you to allow your previous day to drown with that sunset. And the sunrise tells you, look forward. I think God sent that message. We don't take that seriously. So you just sleep it over. The night makes you forget what happened. Just let it go, learn from it, and move forward. I think life will be much better and the world will be a much better place if we can think that way. So these would be books, etc., that I would recommend. My TEDs are very, very focused on education. I would urge people to read, listen to Edward de Bono. Gives you a lot of perspective. I, again, was blessed to share a lot of space with him, time with him. He flew to India to actually see one of our quiz shows, which probably was one of the humbling moments for us in our career. Remarkable man who taught the world how to use their own mind to solve problems. I think we use a lot of our mental acumen and space to identify problems. We don't use it equally well to solve them. So I think that is important. It's very, very important. De Bono tried doing that with a framework for it, not just an advocacy for it, but with a clear framework for it. The others are all, of course, my favorites in education and so on and so forth. So I think, it's not in the modern world, because there is so much of an explosion of material available. I would say anything that you like, indulge in it, but allocate time to reading, listening, something that is useful, that takes you to your tomorrow. I wouldn't like to be prescriptive. I've never asked my kids to read this or listen to this or do anything like this. Yeah, they come and keep, nudging into my bookshelf and, looking for something sometimes. My daughter's a voracious reader, so she always keeps searching in my library on if there's something for her to read. I don't force reading on people. I don't force it because it has to come from within. And at the end of the day, it's the world's most positive addiction. So indulge in it.
So true. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Giri, and for all the listeners and audience. I'm sure you enjoyed it as much as I did. And so please go ahead, share this with others who you think will like it and enjoy it. And do come back, because we're going to have Giri again to talk a lot more. And until then, enjoy the ride. Thank you again.
Well.